Hello, my name is Dr. Tracey Owens Patton, and today I'd like to talk with you about rodeo culture and its diverse beginnings. I'm a professor who specializes in examining cultures through a cross-cultural lens, and I've also co-authored a book on diversity found within cowboy and cowgirl culture, a diversity that is seen in the past and present of the sport. Rodeo and cowboy and cowgirl culture, once it gets to the Americas, and specifically today's United States, was filled with Latinx, Native, and Black cowboys who were some of the best people in the sport. Yet, when we look at the sport of rodeo and cowboy and cowgirl culture, we see a white-dominated sport. The Professional Cowboy Rodeos Association, or PRCA, doesn't keep official stats as related to race and ethnicity, but it is estimated that about 97% of these athletes are white. So why does knowing about the demographic makeup of a sport matter? In this case, understanding gender, racial, and ethnic diversity in rodeo matters so we can begin to understand why rodeo looks the way that it does and who or who does not gravitate to the sport today. And we need to understand how socioeconomic status and location impact recruitment into rodeo today. For example, rodeo is an expensive sport. Many people encounter rodeo and the necessary skills needed to succeed in the sport through working on their family's ranch. But what if you live in a city? What if you don't have access to horses, bulls, and goats? What if you can't afford the boarding fees for the animals? In communities of color, there is a distancing to their agricultural past, and what this shows is access matters now in the present as it relates to rodeo. It's important to remember that Latinx, Native, and Black cowboys brought millennia of agricultural knowledge to the Americas, and this indigenous and agricultural knowledge helped shape rodeo into the sport it is today in the United States. I can't cover everything in this brief discussion with you today, so I'll focus on how to better understand rodeo's past, and I will mention a couple of cowgirls and cowboys who are foundational to the sport so we can better understand where rodeo was and you can better imagine where it needs to go in the future. It's important to understand how rodeo can once again better reflect the ethnic, gender, and racial diversity it once had, and understand the root causes that shut people of color and women out of the arena. I'm going to do something that I rarely do in class, and I never do, or at least most people never ask me to do, and that is to sing. You might know this song, it's rather famous. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the sky is not clouded all day. I could go on, but I think we should stop there. And poor singing aside, I bet most of us know this rousing campfire song that has been attributed to Brewster Higley. Home on the Range encapsulates what many of us believe to be the cowboy on the western frontier before the onset of the Industrial Revolution, where there was freedom of space, freedom from the overcrowded East Coast, and freedom for movement for white bodies, particularly white male bodies. However, what we think we know about this English or Scottish-inspired frontier battle was actually the song written and sung by a Black American chuckwagon cook. As historian Robert Cantwell asserted, quote, John Lomax collected his most famous song, Home on the Range, not from a golden-haired woman, but from a black cook who once worked a chuck wagon on the Texas Cattle Trail in a low drinking dive in San Antonio. Lomax consistently obscured Black collaboration, end quote. Stories about the contributions of people of color to the West are often overlooked or erased in favor of maintaining the myth of an all-white West, and we saw this erasure with the song Home on the Range, which was originally attributed to a Black American cook. We rarely know these stories of people of color in the West and their formation of the West, and this includes knowing the stories of cowgirls and cowboys who are Black, Latinx, and Native, who were once and are vibrant parts of the West. When we think of rodeo, we think of a sport that is white, Western, a U.S. creation, something as American as apple pie and baseball, but that would be incorrect. Rodeo is a sport that has international and cross-cultural roots. It is a sport that once had a diverse beginning. For example, there are ancient drawings from the Cro-Magnon era, so 10,000 to 20,000 years ago, which suggest nomads used things like halters and bridles to control horses. There were references to this sport we call rodeo that go all the way back to ancient Greece. And it is in 1000 AD in Ireland, in fact, where we see the word rodeo for the very first time. But if we really want to understand rodeo today, we need to go back to the African continent. The actual sport, as it is today, comes from Africa thanks to the Moors. Even the long valorized and prized longhorns of the Texas can trace their ancestry to the Moors in Africa, who tended to them for thousands of years on the plains in Africa in the north and in Andalusia. Rodeo today comes from the ancient Greece and then goes to the Moors, who were African, to Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus then took the Moors' version of rodeo and brought it to Spain, and then from there he took it to Hispaniola, which is today's Dominican Republic and Haiti. And then from there it traveled up through the Americas. Because of this route, Spanish culture is often credited for the current formation of rodeo in the United States by way of African knowledge and creation. South America has a vibrant vaquero culture where white men eventually learned the sport from Latinx, Native American, and Black American cowboys, and then appropriated their skills and knowledge that helped create rodeo in the first place. White men eventually commercialized the sport, and that's what we have with rodeo today. So who started this myth of the White West? The myth of the White West began long before televisual images and long before film, long before another white actor played Bass Reeves. Yes, better known as the Lone Ranger. Yes, Bass Reeves was Black. But yet again, in 2013 Hollywood, they cast another actor, this time Armie Hammer, to portray a Black historical figure. The myth of the West marked a time where it was believed that the West was an open space for the taking, erasing Native Americans, erasing genocide, and erasing stolen land and culture. The West and the expansion westward are considered to be most synonymous with ideological dominant white American culture, but the West really has very rich multicultural traditions. The West and the expansion westward are considered to be most synonymous with this idea of manifest destiny. The myth of the West was this idea of expansion, and we can really think very creative public relations campaigns in capitalizing on this. Manifest destiny is between the years 1812 to 1860, and manifest destiny was used to, one, expand the population over North America all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Number two, the myth meant freedom of space from the overcrowded East Coast. Three, the myth meant simply freedom of movement, particularly for white people. Four, the myth was something that Theodore Roosevelt, a former U.S. president, Frederick Jackson Turner, a historian, and Owen Wister, author of The Virginian, all popularized. 5, the myth promoted the expansion of the U.S. in dime novels featuring people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. And 6, the myth was marketed as a place for people to distress, to get away, romancing a simpler time, primarily for white people only. But this space did not exist. Instead, the myth relied on the erasure of people, genocide. Also, the empty space did not exist because there were already things in place, like the Industrial Revolution, the Transcontinental Railroad, fencing, and private property. In other words, the myth of the West and the myth of manifest destiny was a mediated fantasy and PR and marketing campaign, and a very successful PR and marketing campaign because 50,000 Americans went from the West and hit the Oregon Trail. In reality, by the time Frederick Remington created his iconic paintings and Owen Wister penned his novel, The Virginian, in 1902, the romantic West, where life was said to be simple, had disappeared. The great cattle drives were long gone. The railroad tracks spanned the country. Wister's imaginary West ended in 1892 with the Johnson County War. The Johnson County War, also referred to as the War on the Powder River, occurred in Wyoming in April 1892. This war was a clash between the explosion of small ranches where many cowboys were forced to homestead in areas, and the larger ranches run by big cattlemen were upset by the number of new ranches that had sprung up there. The battle resulted in a gunfight and a 2-day standoff between ranchers, hired guns, and law enforcement. Eventually, the U.S. Cavalry, Wyoming senators, an acting Wyoming governor, and the U.S. President Benjamin Harrison were all dispatched to stop the fighting. It can be argued that white people in the West, before and after Wister's contributions, were erased, and the biggest effect were on people of color and women. Owen Wister knew that the West was diverse with people of color and women as the co-collaborators of the West, and simply wrote them out. Historians then were complicitous because they too wrote them out to make space for whiteness. And even during enslavement, some people who were enslaved were gifted in the arena and rode for plantation owners who sought fame and money off the backs of these gifted athletes. A few were able to keep some of the purse, some of the winnings, and eventually buy their freedom, thus purchasing their freedom, but also making their slave owner wealthy at the same time. So who was written out of the West? Let's look at Remington and Wister's world to find out who was written out. At one point, there were over 40,000 men who were cowboys and involved in cattle drives before the turn of the century. Of this number, 25 to 30% were Latinx, Native American, or Black American. And through Remington and Wister's worldview, the widely known and respected Buffalo Soldiers were simply ignored. The Buffalo Soldiers were a Black American cavalry unit and infantry regiments that served in Arizona, the Dakota Territory, Kansas, Montana, New Mexico, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, Utah, Wyoming, and as far south as Mexico. And even though dime novels, TV, and Hollywood may make cowboys of color and rodeo and cowboy culture minor characters or erase them altogether, they rounded up and branded millions of cattle. So what was life like for these cowboys of color? Cowboys of color roped, hunched in their saddles during a blizzard, lived off the land, rode wild horses, dealt with rattlesnakes. Their lives were difficult and dangerous, much like what we imagine life to be like then as a cowboy, regardless of color. And then on top of it all, these cowboys of color had to deal with racism at an individual, structural, and institutional level. For example, even as part of cowboy culture, Black men were often the cooks on cattle drives and rarely the foremen. Jim Perry from XIT Ranch in Texas in the late 1800s was only allowed to be a cook and said, quote, "If it wasn't for this old black face, I would have been boss of one of these divisions long ago," end quote. What Perry was stating was that he hit the racist glass ceiling. That ceiling, coupled with things like enslavement, sharecropping, U.S. laws like Jim Crow, had a huge negative impact in terms of ethnic and racial diversity in rodeo. White men learned the sport from men of color, then shut them out of the arena with justifications like enslavement and U.S. Jim Crow laws. Rodeo and organizations like the PRCA did not have overt policies banning black cowboys, but they complied with U.S. Jim Crow laws and local arenas, which could have their own rules, where they frequently saw signs that said, "No dogs, no Mexicans, no Negroes." Even the word cowboy was once steeped in racism. White men were referred to as cowhands, and cowboys was a term specifically reserved for black cowboys. The focus here is on the word boy, which is racist and demeaning and used during and after enslavement. Boy implies that black men are not equal with white men, but rather inferior to white people and white culture generally. Once black cowboys gained fame in the arena, even during enslavement, the term cowboy then became applied to everyone. And if we look at women in rodeo, they were shut out of the arena due to sexism. Sadly, through laws, language, and treatment, it can be argued that white culture generally and white patriarchal culture went out of its way to eliminate cowgirls and people of color presence in rodeo. Language was a powerful way to keep people of color out of the arena. Through language and such hierarchies as cowhand versus cowboy, or even putting the N word in front of a black cowboy's name, this linguistically shows through language that that person was not wanted or welcome in the arena. In the 1960s, there were certain times when cowboys of color could even ride, and this is exemplified with Meredith Steitman, who was once referred to as the Jackie Robinson of bull riding and the first black American to qualify for the PRCA in 1967 and 1968. And he had to ride before white audiences arrived in the stands or after white people left the stands. When Steitman asked what it would take for him to win a world title, he received this response, quote, "Keep riding bulls like you are and turn white," end quote. Even today, when a cowboy of color is being compared to animals, this is problematic because the cowboy is supposed to best or dominate the animal. Use of an animal moniker like a lion, that cowboy did X, is problematic because it puts the cowboy of color in the animal position. And if the animal wins, the cowboy loses. There are also current issues with regard to lower purse or lower pay, as well as promotion. Now that we know a little bit more about the historical background of rodeo, let's turn to some of the extraordinary achievements of a few cowboys and cowgirls who continue to affect the sport of rodeo today through their legacy. When we think about rodeo, the first official rodeo was given the date of July 4th, 1869 in Deer Trail, Colorado. Nat Love is one of those people that we think about with rodeo. He was also known as Deadwood Dick. He was a black American and was first recorded as a cowboy in a cowboy tournament that he was in on July 4th, 1876. When he was a cowboy, 1 in 4 cowboys were black American. Women often bested men in the arena, despite of or in spite of sexism in the arena, and by the 1890s, Annie Oakley was considered a national icon. Oakley was able to perform amazing feats in the arena and was also a professional shooter. And she's credited with being the first performer to promote the All-American Cowgirl, which allowed her the freedom to compete athletically against men in her profession. Bill Pickett is from Taylor, Texas, and he invented bulldogging in 1904, and this is a technique that is still done today. Pickett got the idea after watching sheepdogs subdue a steer. Bulldogging is where Pickett bit the lower lip of a steer to control the animal. At times, to perform this amazing feat, Pickett had to dress like a Mexican toreador to even get into the arena to show his technique because no black people were allowed in the arena. Jackson Sundown, George Fletcher, and John Spain. This is quite the story. Jackson Sundown was a Nez Perce cowboy, and he was meant to be a Pendleton champion. And in 1916 became a world champion bronc rider. He was over 50 years old when he accomplished this feat. But in 1911, in Pendleton, Oregon, Sundown competed for the championship against George Fletcher, who was a Black American, and John Spain, who was a white American. And what is still seen and talked about as a controversy to this day amongst rodeo historians was at the end of the competition, Spain was unfairly judged to be the winner of the bronc riding, with Fletcher coming into second and Sundown coming in third. The crowd was livid and booed. The newspaper then tried to cover and justify the ruling, saying that Fletcher had the showier ride, but Spain had the harder horse to cover. But historian Joel Bernstein said, quote, "Was a black cowboy or an Indian cowboy going to be judged superior to a white cowboy? Times were different in 1911, end quote." Florence Ladue is an interesting story as well, because we have two marginalized people centered in the arena. Person worked as a ranch hand for 10 years before competing at Pendleton Roundup in 1912, 2 years after the Pendleton Rodeo was founded. Persons is credited with making rodeo accessible to Native cowboys. In this image, Ladue is involved in a stunt and or showcasing her roping talent, or she could even be trying to stop his horse after a stunt. What makes this image iconic is the two of them in the arena together. Jesse Stahl, this is one of my favorite images of all of rodeo. He was a bronc rider who rode the famous horse Glass Eye. In 1920, Stahl was voted the best wild horse rider in the West. The reason why I love this image is because if you look at the expression on Stahl's face, it is pure joy. It's pure happiness just for those few seconds of man versus beast. This is quite a unique image that you're seeing here of Mrs. Sherry in 1921. Black American cowgirls and images of them are extremely rare, and women of color in rodeo generally are rare. Here is a publicity photo from Doubleday in 1921, which shows 5 cowgirl trick riders in the hippodrome pose. In the middle of this group is Black American trick rider Mrs. Sherry. Bonnie McCarroll is an example of the Cheyenne girl. Cowgirls like McCarroll are shown in images where the women are in dirt and grit and physically demanding events and in dangerous situations, not unlike the cowgirls of today. In 1917, McCarroll was bucked off a bronc at the Pendleton Roundup, and this iconic photo captures her mid-fall and her horse in mid-buck. McCarroll fell upside down and landed on her neck. She was dressed, as you can see, in a blouse and in a skirt. She died several years later from a similar fall in 1929. Only this time she died. And one of the reasons attributed to this is because in her fall in 1917, her feet were free. You can see that her feet are free because she's not attached to the horse. She's away from the horse. But as the years went on, when she was in her second fall that ultimately killed her in 1929, her feet were hobbled. And hobbling was only applied to women, which is why it is seen as sexist, where it was supposed to be that the woman, the cowgirl, would have an easier ride if her feet were stuck in the stirrups. That may or may not have been true, but whenever you have a fall like this, like what McCarroll went through, once she fell, she couldn't move her feet. She couldn't get her feet free, so the horse fell on top of her, injuring her, and she later died. After this accident, McCarroll's death hastened the demise of cowgirls competing in rough stock competitions, and by 1925, women in rodeo were rounded up and put into pasture since the numbers of women in rodeo plummeted, and by the 1940s, only a few contests remained open for cowgirls and competitors. Through the decades, cowgirls have had to fight their way and have found creative ways to stay connected to the sport that they love, and a few remain in this arena today. McLean and Tom Reeves are two interesting individuals as well, because both of them hold world champion Indian bronc rider titles. In 1962, McLean was the world saddle bronc riding champion, and he was the 5-time saddle bronc riding champion in the Canadian Professional Rodeo Association and 4-time champion in the Canadian All-Around Championship, and in 1972, the Canadian champion steer wrestler and calf roper, and qualified for the National Finals Rodeo and Calf Roping. In 2001, McLean was the world champion senior pro calf roper. With all of this past success that I've shared with you today, what perpetuates erasure? With all of the past diverse influences in the sport of rodeo, what influences the idea that it is a sport largely, predominantly for white men? I would argue that it's stereotypical marketing found within the tourism industry and media industries. And even today, where there are shows about the West, there's usually one lone Black person, and the West is seen as a white world, place, and space, with one guy, his 6-shooter, and traditional gender roles. TV and Hollywood still make the West and rodeo seem white. Even when you have Django Unchained with Jamie Foxx as the lead, his role and place still seems non-plausible given the long legacy of erasure of people of color in the West. So why does understanding the past of the diverse foundation of rodeo matter today? It matters because rodeo has an amazingly rich cross-cultural foundation with ethnic, gender, and racial diversity. Understanding diversity in rodeo matters today because the truth is that Latinx, Native, and Black people never left rodeo. They have claimed their space. There are large online communities and social media communities that popular media misses. For example, in 2021, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo traveled to 37 cities to introduce the sport to youth who live in densely populated areas. The Soul Circuit, which became the Southwestern Cowboys Association, still exists. And there is an organization called the Compton Cowboys, which brings farming and horse experiences to that city. There's also the Yeehaw agenda, which centers women in rodeo, encouraging their participation. There are also Hollywood celebrities who are involved in rodeo. For example, James Pickens Jr., you might know him as Dr. Weber from Grey's Anatomy, is a steer roper. Lil Nas X entered the cowboy culture with his outfits and in particular with his huge hit Old Town Road. And Megan Thee Stallion wore bedazzled chaps, which I would argue is a nod to the rich culture of cowgirls and rodeo queens. Finally, Wyoming is a state that is often associated with rodeo, and understanding the diversity of such a sport means that we have a greater understanding of Wyoming as a state. And that's why it's important. Thank you so much.